Earlier in this day of training, you created an item renderer for the data group container and then applied it to two Spark list controls. In the last exercise, you used the data grid control to display data. In this video, you bring your knowledge of item renderers to the data grid control and learn how to create both item renderers and item editors. You will also learn how to create renderers and editors as drop-in, inline, and component implementations. Since the data grid control is an MX component, you can easily use MX components inside of the renderers. However, you will also learn how to use Spark components in the renderers as well. Lastly, you will learn how to handle a click event on the item in the data grid control. This is the application that you built in the last exercise. By default, a data grid control displays one data field per column, but you implemented a formatter to display two data fields in this first column. Note, however, that you displayed these two data fields in one text string by concatenating them together. In order to display two or more components in a data grid column, you must create an item renderer for the column. In this video, I will create this item renderer for the first column, which displays not only the employee name data, but also an image of the employee. I will also create an item editor, which allows users to edit the data in the data grid control. Lastly, I will handle a click on a record in the control to display employee contact information in a panel container. You are familiar with item renderers, but what is an item editor? These two elements behave and look different. An item renderer is displayed by default in a data grid column. An item editor is only used when an item is being edited. You can have the item renderer act as the item editor by setting the renderer is editor property to true. This example shows text displayed by default in the item renderer for the vacation days column. However, when a user clicks in the field to edit it, then the registered item editor appears. This is the case of an item renderer and an item editor set to different displays. This is a similar case where the item renderer and the editors are set to different displays. By default, the item renderer simply displays the text value of a Boolean field. You can imagine a checkbox could be implemented for the item editor. While this is fine, it would actually be easier for you to just implement the item editor, a checkbox, as both the item editor and item renderer. It is much more intuitive to display a checkbox control than the strings true and false. You can implement item renderer and item editors in three ways: as drop-in, inline, or component code. To implement a drop-in item renderer, you simply reference a component class file directly in the item renderer or item editor property of a data grid column instance. You can bind the data in the column to different properties of the drop-in component using the editor data field property. For instance, you could set a column to display the X property of a text control. However, you would probably rather display the text property of a text control. If you want to use the item editor for the item renderer as well, set the renderer is editor property to true. In this code example, you can see that the checkbox class is referenced as the item renderer property. Since the selected property of the checkbox control tells you whether the control is selected or not, you use that value in the editor data field property. Note that this example also has the renderer is editor property set to true. This will ensure that the checkbox control will be displayed as shown here, whether you are simply rendering or editing the column. This is the main application file for this example. You can see that I'm retrieving employee information in this HTTP service call and then populating the employee list array collection variable with the data using the result handler. When I run the file, you can see that the data grid control displays the employee's full name, hire date, and available days of vacation. Notice that the data grid control is not editable. Back in the code, I'm adding the editable property to the data grid instance with a value of true. In a data grid control, to make any column editable, you must turn on editability for the entire control and then turn off the editability on the columns that should not be editable. I am adding the editable property to the employee name and hire date fields, since I only want the vacation column to be editable. I'm adding the item editor property to the vacation eligibility column because I want to apply a drop-in control only when the user is editing the cell. Specifically, I am dropping in the mx.controls.numeric_stepper class. The number that appears in the numeric stepper control is stored in the value property of the instance. So I am adding the editor data field property with a value of value. I am saving the file and then running the application. You can see that the numeric stepper control only appears when I click into a cell to edit it. If I want the numeric stepper control to always appear, then I can change the item editor property to item renderer and also add the renderer is editor property with a value of true. When I save the file and run this version, you can see that the numeric stepper always appears. I also want to limit the maximum and minimum values for this control to 26 and 2 respectively. Unfortunately, when you create a drop-in renderer or editor, you cannot do this. Drop-in item renderers are easy to use, but since you are only referring to the class name in the item renderer or item editor properties, you don't have a way to pass additional properties to the control. You can have full control over the properties of your renderer or editor by implementing them in line. The first step to do this is to create the item renderer or item editor properties as nested properties of the data grid column instance rather than as properties in the tag. Within the nested property tag block, you will then add an FX component tag block. Within that, you can add your visual controls, which can be simple or complex displays. This code sample shows an item editor property nested inside of a data grid column block. Within that is a components block that specifies a new scope for the item renderer. Within the component block, you can place a control for display. Note that since you are defining an instance, you can apply additional properties to the control like the minimum and maximum values for this numeric stepper control. This is very similar to creating item renders for the data group container that you learned how to create at the beginning of this day of training. Note, however, that you do not have an item renderer class instance nested within the components instance for an MX data grid container as you did in the Spark data group container. If you have more than one control to display in your editor or renderer, you should place the controls within a container. This code shows the text and image controls nested within an MX box container. In the data grid column instance for the vacation eligibility column, I'm deleting the item renderer and editor data field properties and then converting the data grid column tag into a tag block. I'm creating a nested item renderer property tag block inside of it and then a component tag block inside of that. Inside the component, I'm creating an MX numeric stepper instance with a minimum property value of 2 and a maximum property value of 26. You might have seen in the code hinting that there is a Spark numeric stepper control. But because the data grid control is an MX component without a Spark equivalent in Flex 4, you cannot use a Spark component directly inside of it. You will learn how to get around this Spark problem in a few minutes. When I save the file and run the application, You can see that the numeric stepper control now has an upper limit of 26 and a lower limit of 2. Now I want to create a more complicated display for the first column. Rather than just showing the employee's full name, I want to show their full name and image. Again, just like the data group item renderer, you can create the item render or item editor for a data grid component as a separate class file. I'm creating a new folder to hold my new component by right-clicking on the source folder and selecting New Folder. I am naming the folder Components and then clicking the Finish button. Now I'm creating the new component class file by right-clicking on the Components folder and selecting New MXML Item Renderer. Notice that the package should be Components to match the folder I just created, and that the name of the component will be Employee Item Renderer. I'm selecting from the template Item Render for MX Data Grid, and then I'm clicking the Finish button to see the new file open in the editor view. Note that it does extend the MX Data Grid Item Renderer class. So far you have learned that because the data grid control is an MX component, you were limited to using MX components inline. However, with Flex 4 you can use Spark components inline with a data grid control if you use the MX Data Grid Item Renderer class. This is the base class for Spark Item Renderer used in a data grid control. I am deleting the generated label control and am adding a border container tag set with a background color property set to a value of CCCCCC, which is gray. Inside the border container tag block, I am creating a layout property tag set and adding the vertical layout component. To it, I'm adding the horizontal align property with a value of center and the vertical align property with a value of middle. As with the item renders for the data group container, when working with the data grid control, you will access the properties in the data provider object through the data object. After the layout property, I'm adding a label control with a text property bound to the data.firstName, a literal space, and then the data.lastName. After the label control, I'm adding an image control with a source property that has the literal string of images / then a binding to data.id followed by the literal .jpg. This will dynamically create the employee's image name from the ID property in the XML file. This will match the employee's image name in the images directory. I'm saving the file and returning to the main application file. I'm deleting the label function property from the employee name data grid column and adding the item renderer property. I don't need the label function property anymore because I'm using the item renderer to handle the display. For the value, I'm selecting the employee item renderer class that I just created. When I save the file and run the application, you can see that the item renderer displays the employee name and image vertically and horizontally centered in a gray background. Note that the numeric stepper component display, however, is too large. It's expanding to fill up the entire cell. Earlier I mentioned that you cannot directly nest Spark components within the data grid columns. However, since then you have learned about the MX Data Grid Item Renderer class, which has been created to bypass this problem. I will use this class in my renderer so that I can replace the MX numeric stepper with the Spark numeric stepper control. First, I am placing an MX Data Grid Item Render instance in line around the numeric stepper control. When I save the file and run the application, you can see that the numeric stepper control is not expanding to the entire cell anymore. This is because adding the MX Data Grid Item Renderer instance around the control has made the numeric stepper a child of the item renderer rather than the item renderer itself. Note, however, that the values in the control are set to 2, which is the minimum value we set in the code. I'll fix this in a moment. Right now I'm changing the numeric stepper control to a Spark namespace. The MX and Spark controls don't look much different, but remember that whenever you can, you should use the Spark equivalent over the MX control. I've already saved the file and now I'm running it so that you can see that the Spark control works just fine, but the value of 2 is still displayed for all instances. The problem is that the control has lost access to the data from the data provider property because the numeric stepper control now exists inside of a component instance that extends the MX Data Grid Item Renderer class. It is in a new scope and you must access the data through the data property as you did when you created the separate item renderer class file. I'm adding a value property to the numeric stepper control with a value bound to the data.vacation eligibility property. I am saving the file and running the application. You can see that the numeric stepper now reflects the correct value. For the last section of this video, I will show you how to capture a user click on a cell and perform an action. When a user clicks on a record of this data grid control, you will handle the item click event and display a container with the employee's details. Below the data grid control, I have added a panel container with 4 properties: an ID property with a value of contact info, a title property with a value of contact information, a visible property set to false, and a width property with a value of 200. Inside the panel container, I have vertically laid out 2 label controls, one each for email and phone number. I'm registering the item click event with the data grid control and then using the Flash Builder code generation tool to create the item click event handler, which I'm locating here in the script block. I'm deleting the generated comment and assigning a value to the email.text property of the label control. The data stored in the selected data grid row is referenced in the event.target.selected item object. I want to display the email value specifically, so for the email.text property, I'm assigning the literal text email : space plus event.target.selected item.email. I'm adding the phone.text property and assigning a literal text phone and concatenating the event.target.selected item.phone property. The panel container is initially invisible, but I want to make it visible when the user selects a row. I'm setting the contact info panel's visible property to true. When I save the file and run the application, you see the data grid control. When I click on an employee, you don't see the panel appear. This is because the application's layout property is set to vertical layout. This means that the header label is above the data grid control, which is above the panel. I'm surrounding the data grid control and the panel with an H group container so that they will be placed next to each other horizontally. Remember that I want to tab in nested tags. Now when I save the file and run the application and click on an employee, you can see that that employee's data is displayed in the panel container to the right of the data grid. For your next step, work through the exercise titled Creating and Using Item Renderers and Item Editors.